skeleton has no accent. It cannot lie about where it came from, what language it whispered in childhood, or which god it prayed to before it died. And that is precisely why, for 150 years, the people who invented civilization itself remain the greatest unsolved mystery in archaeology. We had their cities. We had their laws carved in stone. We had their kings' names stretching back further than any other record on Earth. What we did not have, until shockingly recently, was a single reliable strand of their DNA. And when scientists finally found a way to listen to what the bones themselves had to say, the answer was not what anyone expected. Not the priests who copied the old tablets 4,000 years. Ego, not the fringe theorists who spent decades insisting these people came from somewhere beyond the sky, somewhere beneath the sun-scorched floodplain where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers braid together in southern Iraq. A group of farmers accomplished something no human beings had ever done before. They built the first city, then the second, then a dozen more. They invented writing before anyone else on the planet had thought to press a reed into wet clay. They wrote the first laws, ran the first schools, kept the first receipts, and told the first stories anyone ever bothered to preserve. Historians call them the Sumerians, and every civilization that followed. Babylon, Assyria, arguably. Egypt, arguably Rome, arguably us, stands on a foundation these people poured into the mud roughly 5,000 years ago. And yet ask any Sumerian who they were, where their ancestors came from, and the tablets give you an answer soaked in mythology rather than memory. Their own histories claim that kingship itself fell out of the heavens and landed in a city called BeiDou, all where the first king ruled for nearly 29,000 years. Not 29 years, 29,000. The list continues through 7 more kings, each with reigns so long that no human body, no human civilization, no human anything could plausibly sustain them. Tens of thousands of years apiece, stacked one after another, until the whole antediluvian dynasty totals nearly 250,000 years of rule before a catastrophic flood supposedly wipes the slate clean, and human lifespans finally shrink down to something recognizable. For over a century, this document, engraved on a clay prism you can still walk up to today in a museum in England, has haunted historians precisely because it refuses to be simple. Some of the later kings on that same list are demonstrably real. Archaeologists have pulled physical inscriptions out of the ground bearing their names, confirming rulers that generations of scholars once assumed were pure legend. But the deeper you go into the list, the stranger it becomes until you're staring at names attached to lifespans that violate biology itself. The same scribes, writing in the same careful hand, on the same physical object, mixed verifiable history with numbers that belonged to gods. And nothing in the clay could ever tell us which parts were memory and which parts were myth. Layered on top of the impossible numbers is an even deeper puzzle, one that lives not in the mathematics, but in the mouths of the people who spoke it. Nearly every ancient language surrounding Sumer belongs to a family we can trace. Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian all descend from the same Semitic branch that eventually produces Hebrew and Arabic. The Persians who arrive later speak an early cousin of Sanskrit, distantly related to half the languages spoken across Europe today. Sumerian belongs to none of it. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known relatives, no traceable parent, and no surviving descendant. It simply appears, fully formed, spoken by a people who leave behind the most sophisticated writing system the ancient world had ever seen, and then, over the following centuries, it quietly dies, preserved only by priests reciting it the way medieval clergy once kept Latin alive, long after ordinary people stopped speaking it in the street. The people who invent civilization speak a language unlike anything around them, and then vanish from the historical record without leaving a linguistic trace anywhere on Earth. It is almost designed to invite wild explanations, and for decades it did. In the 1970s, one author took that vacuum of certainty and filled it with something far more dramatic than farmers stumbling into greatness. He proposed that the Sumerian gods referenced constantly throughout their mythology, beings the texts call the Anunnaki, were not gods at all but visitors, extraterrestrial travelers who supposedly descended to Earth, established the first cities as outposts, ruled directly over early humanity, and interbred with our species S before departing, leaving behind exactly the kind of impossible king list a civilization founded by non-human rulers might produce. Under this theory, the tens of thousands of years attributed to the earliest kings were not exaggeration or propaganda. They were literal, because the beings wearing those crowns were never human to begin with. It is worth being unambiguous about something here. Not a single credentialed Sumerologist, archaeologist, or geneticist working today treats that theory as remotely plausible. The translations underpinning it have been examined repeatedly by scholars fluent in actual cuneiform, and the consensus is stark. The source material was fundamentally mistranslated. The Anunnaki of the real texts are the traditional divine assembly of Mesopotamian religion. Sky gods, earth gods, the pantheon presiding over human affairs, the way Zeus and Hera preside over Greek mythology. Not pilots, not colonists, not a genetic experiment, but dismissing a theory intellectually and killing it culturally are two very different things, and for good reason. This one refused to die quietly, because underneath the far-fetched packaging sat a genuinely uncomfortable question that legitimate scholars could never fully answer either. How, precisely, does a species with no cities, and no writing, no formal law, and no organized education suddenly produce all four within the span of a few centuries, in one place, seemingly out of nothing? The scale of that leap is so enormous that for many people, an outside intervention felt almost more believable than the alternative, that a handful of Bronze Age farmers simply did it themselves, through nothing but accumulated ingenuity and time. The impossible-sounding explanation offered a cause. The mundane explanation offered only a shrug. Tablets could never resolve that argument, because tablets are made of words, and words can be composed, embellished, or quietly rewritten by whoever holds the stylus. There was only ever one form of evidence immune to spin: the biological record locked inside the bodies of the Sumerians themselves. If scientists could ever extract genuine, uncorrupted DNA from an actual Sumerian skeleton, the question would finally have a real answer. Ordinary humans, identical to their neighbors, or something that did not belong. For most of the 20th century, nobody could deliver that answer, and the reason is one of the more quietly tragic details in the entire story. DNA is an extraordinarily fragile molecule. From the instant an organism dies, enzymes and environmental exposure begin tearing the genetic code apart, fragment by fragment. Cold dramatically slows that decay, which is why the finest preserved ancient genomes on Earth tend to come from Siberia, Greenland, and other places where bodies have effectively sat inside a natural freezer for millennia. Heat does the opposite. It accelerates the collapse. Southern Iraq is one of the hottest, continuously inhabited regions on the planet, with summer ground temperatures capable of climbing past 50 degrees Celsius. For 5,000 years, the remains of the Sumerians have essentially been baking in an oven built by geography itself. By the time modern researchers exhume a skeleton from that soil, the genetic material inside it has usually degraded into fragments too short, too damaged, and too contaminated by soil bacteria to reconstruct into anything scientifically usable. The civilization that gave humanity its first written words left behind almost no readable genetic code at all. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. The Sumerians are, in a very real sense, disappearing twice. The first disappearance happened in antiquity, as their cities emptied, their political power dissolved into conquering empires, and their spoken language faded into the private vocabulary of temple priests before vanishing from daily life completely. The second disappearance is happening right now, silently, underground, as the very molecules capable of finally answering who these people were continue dissolving into biochemical noise with every passing summer. Every year that goes by erases a little more of the direct evidence permanently. Faced with a population whose own genetic record kept crumbling before scientists could read it, researchers pursue the only strategy left available to them. If they could not read the Sumerians directly, they would read everyone around them instead, and try to reconstruct the missing center from the surrounding evidence, the genetic equivalent of tracing a shadow to infer the shape of the object that cast it. Researchers even setting out to address it directly. What the genomes revealed was not an isolated, mysterious population with no traceable roots. It was a blend, a genetic crossroads formed from the mixing of at least 3 distinct ancestral populations that had been migrating and intermarrying across the region for thousands of years. Hunter-gatherer lineages from Anatolia and what is now Turkey, populations descending from Tihi Caucasus Mountains to the north, and communities rooted in the Levant, the fertile coastal strip running down the eastern Mediterranean. These 3 genetic rivers didn't arrive as separate sealed populations occupying separate territory. They flowed together continuously across the landscape, producing what geneticists describe as a genetic continuum. Travel across the region, and the ancestry composition shifts gradually with you, mile by sign, anywhere in the data, of a population that simply fell out of the sky fully formed. Whatever made the Sumerians extraordinary, the cities, the writing system, the legal codes, the formal schools, none of it was encoded in some exotic, otherworldly genome. It was cultural. It was accumulated knowledge, invention, and organization, achieved by biologically ordinary human beings who happened to be standing at precisely the right place at precisely the Rig HT moment in the story of our species. For anyone still holding out hope that the Sumerians were something more than human, this was, scientifically speaking, the end of the argument. But for everyone else, it opened up a far more human and far more haunting question. If they really were just people, and the evidence increasingly says they were, then what actually happened to all of them? A civilization responsible for this much of human infrastructure does not simply switch off. So where did an entire population go? This is where the investigation shifts from myth to something almost more unsettling. Not what a text claims, but what living people's bodies quietly reveal without their even knowing it. The conventional narrative of Sumer's ending is a story of slow military and political erosion. The independent city-states weakened themselves, fighting one another for regional dominance. The Akkadians rose and absorbed Sumerian territory into a unified empire. Later came the Babylonians. Then the genetics, however, tells an entirely different kind of story, and it is a quietly profound one. When a civilization is politically defeated or absorbed, its people, as a rule, do not vanish. They are folded into whatever comes next. They keep living. They keep raising children. They keep passing their genetic inheritance forward through every subsequent generation, even as their political identity, their spoken language, and their religious system are gradually replaced by those of whoever now rules them. The political entity death, the biological lineage of the actual people who built it, did not stop. It simply kept walking forward through time, layer after layer of history, largely unnoticed. And remarkably, there is a place today where you can still trace its footprints. Deep in the marshlands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread outward into a vast, shifting maze of water and reeds, live a people known as the Marsh Arabs. For thousands of years, this community has maintained a way of life startlingly close to how the ancient Sumerians are depicted living. Constructing houses from bundled reeds atop artificial floating islands using construction techniques that appear, almost unchanged, on 5,000-year-old Sumerian carvings. When geneticists studied the male lineages of this population, they found deep, overwhelmingly local roots in the region, including at least one distinct genetic branch whose expansion appears to correspond, remarkably, with the very period when the first Sumerian cities were rising out of the mud. Consider what that quietly implies. The population that Sumer eventually became may still be living in those same marshes today, building homes over the same waters. In the shadow of an identity most of them have never been taught to claim. They do not call themselves Sumerians. Most likely, the overwhelming majority have never once considered a connection to the god kings recorded on ancient prisms, and yet the genetic record suggests something the history books simply failed to mention. Sumer did not entirely disappear. It was renamed. It was absorbed. It was forgotten by nearly everyone except the DNA itself, which kept quietly copying forward generation after generation into people alive on that same land right now. The genetic threads keep extending outward in directions nobody anticipated. In 2025, researchers successfully sequenced the full genome of a man buried in Egypt roughly 4,500 years ago, placing him almost exactly at the dawn of the pyramid building era. His ancestry was, unsurprisingly, predominantly North African, precisely what one would expect from a burial in the Nile,